everyone, my name is Glenda with SureFit Designs, whimsically known as Glenda the Good Stitch. In this Make It Sew beginner sewing series, I'm going to be talking about recognizing grain line in fabric and the importance of knowing the lengthwise, the crosswise, and the bias grain line in relationship to the layout of your pattern. So I've got a number of pieces of fabric samples out here, and the first thing to recognize is where the selvage is on your fabric. Now, selvage means the finished edge. So as we take a look at this piece of cotton, and I'll just fold it over like this so that you can see it. This edge right here, there's no fibers coming from it. It's the finished edge, and you can see that it's bound really, really tightly, and that's called the selvage of the fabric. Now, all the fibers that run parallel to the selvage, those are the lengthwise fibers, and they are typically going to run up and down your body. Then, perpendicular to the selvage, and perpendicular means a 90-degree angle, there are the crosswise fibers. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to tell you about lengthwise. Lengthwise fibers have next to no stretch in them. So there I am picking up a couple of inches, and you can see that the fabric is not giving, it's not stretching. Now, in opposition to that, we've got our crosswise fibers at a 90-degree angle to the selvage, and they are always the weaker fibers. And so when I take 2 inches here and give it a tug, you can see that there is a little bit of give in that fabric. So they are the weaker fibers, and they generally go around our body. Then the third grain line that we can create is not actually the fiber in the fabric, but the direction of which we would lay the pattern, and that's called the bias. Now, anything that is on an angle that's not on the crosswise or not on the lengthwise is on a bias. And when we ask, or when a pattern asks for true bias, that means it's at a 45-degree angle between the crosswise and the lengthwise fibers. And so in order to show you a really excellent example of bias, I'm going to, let me start again. I'm going to take my selvage and I'm going to pick it up with my right hand. There's the cut edge, and it's always cut on the crosswise. And I'm going to take that corner and I'm going to lay this cut edge along the fold of the fabric. And what I've created here is called the true bias. That is a 45-degree angle, and if I take a couple of inches of that, you can see how much more give it has. And there are lots of instances, well, I might not say lots of instances, but there certainly are instances where you are going to want to cut your pattern on the fold of the fabric. And, or excuse me, on the bias of the fabric is what I wanted to say. So if we take a look at this cowl neck blouse, there is a lot of draping in the front of the bodice, and this has all been cut on the true bias of the fabric so that it would drape even more. I've of course designed the cowl neck into this, which means, and the cowl is going to drape, but it will always look prettier on your body if it is cut on the bias of the fabric. Whereas the sleeve is cut on the lengthwise fibers or lengthwise grain line, and the back is also cut on the lengthwise grain line of the fabric. And another circumstance where you create a bias is when you're doing something like this blouse, which is the surplice or crisscross over your front, and the grain line here is straight up and down the length of the blouse. But as we cut this V-neck like this, I am cutting it on a bias, and it might not be the true bias, but any angle like that is a bias. And because a bias is going to stretch more, it means that V-necks and surplice garments that crisscross over one another like this can often gape open at the neckline, and therefore it means that when you're sewing this, you're likely going to need to consider some stabilization technique so that it doesn't stretch and gape open when you wear the garment. Now, let's also talk about the fabric being wrapped on a bolt. Sometimes the fabric is wrapped with the right side face out, as in the case of this printed fabric. And of course, you can tell that this is a printed fabric because it's a very dominant color on the right side. And when you look at the inside, that those colors aren't coming through. It hasn't been woven all the way through. So this is called a printed fabric. And whereas if we take a look at this bolt of fabric, now I actually don't know which is the right or the wrong side. And you know what? It really doesn't make any difference because the inside looks exactly the same as the outside. So this means that if I was to cut my blouse out of this particular piece of cotton, that after I've got the pattern pieces cut, I'm going to come in with some kind of a marking utensil here. We've got marking pencils. These wash out. Now, I typically have a blue and a white pencil in all of my supplies, but blue isn't going to show up on that. So white is going to work, and I would make a W on here that says that's the wrong side. I could also use a chalk, a tailor's chalk, or I could come by with one of these chalk markers. That's an example of one, and this chalkener is another one, and you can see the white marks. And all of these, they're going to brush off or wash off when the garment is washed. But when something is like this kind of fabric, you definitely want to mark the inside, or what you're considering to be the inside, so that you don't get your pieces mixed up when you start sewing. Another example of fabric where it's hard to tell the inside and the right side is something like this woven herringbone. Here, there is a slight pattern in the fabric, and this is called a herringbone pattern. But when we take a look at the inside of this shirting, you also see that herringbone pattern like that. So again, you have to decide which is going to be your right side, which is going to be your wrong side, and then mark it appropriately after you've got your pattern pieces cut. Here is another example. Let me set that down. And this is a knit that when I found it, I just loved it because I realized it would make a great, not necessarily reversible jacket, but where I could actually decide what side did I want to have as my right side and what side did I want to have as my inside. But because it looked finished on the inside and on the outside, I decided that I could use it for trimming. So here's an example of a hoodie jacket that I did, and I used the beige as the right side, but then when I created the hood and sewed the hood, so if some of that hood shows, it's absolutely fine when it's on my body, because what I did was I took the gray side of the fabric and trimmed the patch pockets right here. So you have lots of fabric choices when it comes to working with fabric. And I shouldn't say lots of fabric choices. You have lots of considerations and choices to make when you're finding your fabric and deciding how you're going to use it. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about layout and why this lengthwise and crosswise grain line is so important. In commercial patterns, we see grain line markings, and let me put that one there and we'll talk about this one for a moment. This piece right here has a grain line marking, and it is a line that is an absolutely straight line, and it has two big dominant triangles at the end. Now when you see a pattern piece like this, that line is telling you that needs to be parallel to your selvage. So if you're doing your pattern layout, and let's say that this piece needed to sit like right there, this grain line marking needs to be totally parallel to the selvage of your fabric. And so you would measure from the arrowhead to the selvage on one end of the pattern piece and the arrowhead to the selvage on the other end of the pattern piece. And those two distances need to be totally parallel. If they're not, you can get your garment twisting on you. I'm sure many of you have had the circumstance where you've bought a pair of ready-to-wear slacks or pants, and the very first time you wear them, the leg starts to twist on your body. Those side seams and inseams will not hang straight on your body. And that's likely because they were mass produced and mass cut. And as the big cutting knife went around to cut that particular pattern piece, the fabric shifted, and it meant that this grain line went like this. And so what happens is, if it's cut off grain, your fabric can twist on your body. And that is why it is so vitally important that that grain line marking be parallel to the selvage. Now, another marking you'll see in a commercial pattern is something like this. And it's a grain line marking, but when the ends of the line become like a U shape right here, and the arrow goes this way towards that line, that's telling you that this particular line needs to be placed on the fold of the fabric. So there's my fold, because that was my selvage on the other side. So that means that this piece is going to lay exactly on the fold. And as long as your fold as long as your fabric has been folded properly, and that fold is parallel to the selvage, then there's nothing to measure, because you're just going to put it in place, pin it, or put down your pattern weights, and it's ready to cut. Now, that's when you're working with a commercial pattern. When you're working with your SureFit Designs patterns and you're drawing them out yourself, you need to mark your grain line markings on them. And so here's an example. This particular pattern is actually the front for the blouse that I'm currently wearing. And so I know that I want the front of the garment on the fold of the fabric. So when I drew the pattern, there's my straight line for the center front. And I've only marked this in pencil, which is really what I want you to do on your patterns, is mark them in pencil, not in pen. And I've just put CF fold. So when I'm doing my layout, that says to me it's a center front fold. If you're more comfortable, of course, you could take a pencil and go like this and make the actual mark. And this is a marking pen, so it's not coming out well on this tracing vellum. But you could take a regular pencil and make a similar kind of indicator as that commercial pattern had. Instead, I just wrote on here center front, place on the fold. And so that means that that pattern piece would lay down like this. And this is the facing. Again, I just said center front, place on the fold. And so I'm going to know exactly where to place that. And then on the back of this top, because I put a zipper in it, then I'd be laying it over and making sure that I had my seam allowance in place and that my long grain line marking was in fact parallel to the selvage. And then one other pattern piece that I want to show you, and it's actually the pattern piece for the drape on this cowl neck, is, remember I said now the front has been cut on the bias. Well, you likely aren't going to do this if you're a beginner, but down the road, you're going to want to understand how to lay a pattern out for something that needs to be cut on the bias. So let me take my cowl neck pattern here, and I'll just put it into the view of the camera. This blue line right here is call it the regular straight of grain. So if I was just simply cutting this without being on the bias, then I would make sure that that grain line marking is in fact parallel to, well, in this case it would need to be placed on the fold of the fabric, so I'd likely turn it around and place it like that. But that would not give the drape on the neckline a lot of drapiness because it's not on the bias, and remember the bias has the most amount of give to it. So what I've done here is I've marked a 45-degree angle in this pink so that you could see it, and that is just telling me that I need to cut the front of this, I need to cut the fold of the fabric on the bias of the fabric. So how I would do this is I'd take my piece of fabric and I would make a bias fold, and of course it would need to be a bigger bias fold than this. I just am limited to the amount of table space that I've got in this demonstration. But there I've now created a bias fold, and that's the true bias. So that means I can take the center front of this particular pattern piece and I can lay it down like this, because now I know that that fold line is exactly on the true bias of the fabric. Again, I said that's more of an intermediate level kind of layout for you, but the ones that you're going to be most concerned about is the layout that your grain line is parallel to the selvage and the fold marking is exactly on the folded edge of the fabric, and that your fabric is laying nice and flat. Okay, in the next lesson we are actually going to go on and I will lay out a pattern piece and I'll talk to you about cutting and marking tools. I would invite you to join the SureFit Designs community, and you can do that very, very easily. Number one, make sure to join the SureFit Designs newsletter. You'll find that on my website at surefitdesigns.com. Go to the bottom of almost any page and you'll see our sign-up form. And when you do, you're going to get some free gifts to get you started. Number two, make sure that you do like and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that when I post new videos, you'll become aware of them. And that's just not surefitdesigns.com. SureFit Designs is my YouTube channel. And then please join our Facebook group. All you need is a Facebook page, and you're welcome to put in your application and we will approve you, and then you'll be able to communicate with others around the globe who are interacting with one another, showing their SureFit Designs garments, asking questions, and in general, having fun with SureFit Designs. I do welcome you to join us.